Thank you so much to the Helen Hamlin Foundation for inviting me to speak. I'm not as grateful to be put at the end of the lineup that we've just experienced. I can't promise you the same degree of charisma, wisdom, heart, and speed, but I'm going to give it a go. So my name is Farah, and I'm here from the Centre for Literacy and Primary Education. And for the next 20 minutes or so, we are going to be looking specifically at an area of research that we've developed over the last 6 years called Reflecting Realities. Spend some time thinking about the purpose and context that's informed this research, give you an insight into the headline figures over the 5-year period that we've been doing this work, and sharing some of the implications for classroom practice and provision. So at the Centre, we work with colleagues around the country and beyond, supporting them to think about how best to develop practice in terms of literacy teaching in the primary sector. Everything that we learn alongside our colleagues informs and shapes and refines our thinking around how to promote and advocate for best practice in all aspects of literacy teaching. As is evident from the previous slide, which is our home, if you like, literature and children's literature is an integral part of the work that we do, and advocating for its use as a central feature of primary provision is a key component of the work that we do. And so in exploring its value and its necessity in the classroom context, we're always trying to interrogate what it is that makes a really good book. What are the key features? What are the key qualities? And consistently, the things that you can see on the screen, there are the things that ultimately make the essence of a really good book. And what we were interested in interrogating was the first of those features and thinking about connection and the ways in which connection to literature can inspire can inspire the development of reader identity as well as writer identity. And so the term Reflecting Realities is a term that was inspired by the work of Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, and many of you will have come across her analogy around books serving as giving the opportunity to serve as windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. This idea that books have an affirming power as well as the power to broaden our outlook by introducing us to places and spaces and people that we may not necessarily encounter in our everyday life. And so this is particularly pertinent given the hostile backdrop against which we are operating and the hostile context in which we are teaching and our children are learning. And this just gives you a snapshot of the time frame in which we've been doing this work and just some of the lowlights of recent years. And so as well as having the capacity to inspire children to become lifelong readers, to support them in terms of socioeconomic shifts and all of the ways in which reading can be powerful that have been mentioned by colleagues who've spoken throughout the morning, they also have the capacity to serve as tools for social justice, and they can either exacerbate the problematic dominant narratives that we've been encountering in recent years, or they can help redress and counteract them. And so that's what part of the reason it was very important to us to explore the extent of representation, specifically ethnic representation within children's books, but also the quality of that representation. And so we decided to conduct the UK's first ever comprehensive survey of the quality and the volume of what that looks like in terms of UK children's publishing. And what you can see over that 5-year period, so we've produced one every year for the last 5 years, and the new one is imminently due to be out. And what you can see is that at the beginning of this process, in the first year of reviewing the content, the output was very, very low. The level of representation, the quality of representation was very, very low. That has grown significantly over the last 5 years, and we welcome that growth, but we welcome it with caution. And I'll talk more about the caution both in this segment, but also in the workshop that we'll have later today. We look at picture books, fiction and non-fiction specifically because those are the titles that make up the core essence of primary classrooms around the country. We look specifically at books aimed at 3 to 11-year-olds because, again, we're looking at primary sector. And we look at the quality of the presence, so not just the volume, not just whether or not there is presence, but what's the nature of that presence and what's the quality of that presence. So we look at casting, we look at who's foregrounded, we look at who's backgrounded. We look at who makes up those core casts. And as you can see in the first year, we were reporting that only 1% of main characters were from a racially minoritized background. That, again, has grown over time. Not significantly, but it is growing and it's going in the right direction in that regard. I think it's important that we commend the growth, we celebrate the growth, and we encourage the continued growth. However, we also consider the context in which this is working. So if we look at the Nielsen Bestseller Awards, so Nielsen will award according to volume of sales, platinum being 1 million, gold being 500,000, and silver being 250,000. So in the first year of doing this work, when we produced our first report that was saying only 1% feature characters main characters from a racially minoritized background, and only 4% of the books feature racially minoritized characters, period. In that first year, these were the best-selling titles in 2017. In the fifth year, when we're reporting that 20% of the books produced feature racially minoritized characters, which is a positive improvement, you can see that the bestseller list still hasn't really shifted very much, if at all. You've got the same authors, the same kind of books being sold to that end. And thinking about the same authors, these are the authors that make up that bestseller list, both in 2017 and again in the fifth year of reporting around this. Now, I'm not going to invite you to kind of analyse the makeup here or do any of that. It's very, very apparent just by the kind of snapshot that you can see on the screen there. And these are the protagonists of the books that those authors have created. Now, when we look at the authors, it's very true that we write what we know, we write what we live, we write from experience. And so as a consequence of the makeup of the authorship of those bestseller lists, what you've got is 10 8-year-old boys, you've got 2 girls, a rat, a worm, and 2 scarecrows, you know. And those 2 scarecrows also happen to be racialized as white. And so you've got this kind of tension where I'm not at all negating the success here, you know, kudos and all the best, but there does need to be a broadening of representation, both in terms of the authors, but also in terms of the output. Otherwise, we've got a very narrow kind of diet going on here in terms of the consumption, and then we have to think about the implications of that in terms of how that shapes young readers' outlooks in that respect. And you can see the ways in which there is a disproportionate kind of promotion and presence of those offset. You look at the buy one, get one half price table, you can see those are the titles that are on the bestsellers list. So it's a kind of self-fulfilling cycle in that respect. And then it would suggest potentially that, well, maybe there just aren't any authors of colour, and maybe there is just a dearth, and so, you know, we work with what we've got. But actually, we know that's not true. We know that there are masses of really good quality British authors of colour producing amazing work. Works like this. When you compare this slide to the previous slide, you can see not just a diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, but you've got intergenerational diversity, you've got you've got gender diversity, you've got it's quite broad. You know, I could go into the ins and outs of those 2 slides there, but that would take a lot longer than the 20-minute slot I've got. But for every Dennis Sims, you've got a ballet kid. For every Wimpy kid, you've got a Planet Omar. For every what's his name, Tom Gates, for every Tom Gates, you've got a Danny Chung. So again, it doesn't have to be an either or. And I think it's really important to stress that, because sometimes when I talk about these things, people are, well, I can't possibly get rid of X because, you know, I grew up on that, or I've got a passion for that, or my child loves it. What are you saying? I'm saying absolutely, you know, so many of the titles on the previous slide are the gateway drug into reading, you know, have sown the seed for the child's want to read and more. But there's so much more that we can do with that. So it's not an either or, it's a let's broaden the shelf. Let's stop thinking about it as a shelf and think about it as a portal that is infinite in its possibility. And so there are 2 tiers to this process. The first tier being holding the publishing industry to account, working alongside them in order to support them to do better in terms of their output. Because if the output isn't there, we as teachers don't have much choice. But then the flip of that, the next tier, is us as educators, as caregivers, as librarians, and as people who have a responsibility for the children in our care, being more discerning in the choices that we make around this. So at about the same time that we launched the first survey, I did some work with some local schools to try and ascertain what the appetite was amongst children, what their perceptions were of the literary landscape, of protagonists and so on and so forth. And these were some of the things that they were saying. And I promise you I wasn't leading. You know, it was a very kind of series of sessions that we did around their impressions around the literary landscape. And it's interesting because what they were saying very much echoed the two anecdotes on the screen that I've shared in past keynotes and in past workshops, where you have Verna Wilkins in '87 being spurred to create her own independent publisher in response to the fact that her then 5-year-old child came home from school with an All About Me book where he had coloured himself in peach. And when she'd offered him a brown crayon to finish that book, he said, I can't do that. You can't do it with the brown crayon because this is for a book. So it needs to be coloured in peach. So you've got that in '87 that makes her go, oh my goodness, why is my child thinking this? Okay, I can see why he's thinking this. When I go into bookshops, when I go into libraries, and when I go into the classroom book corner, of course he's going to have that impression. Similarly, 30 years on, you've got Darren Chetty, a teacher in year 2, talking about the fact that he's conducting a writer's workshop in his essay for The Good Immigrant, and talks about the fact that in inviting the children to draw from experience in order to craft their stories, they still revert to wanting to write white characters over black and brown characters, and that feeling more natural and feeling more appropriate in that context. So in that 30-year window, we haven't really shifted in terms of children's impressions of the literary landscape and their sense of who is and isn't entitled to occupy that space. So we wanted to interrogate that further and sought funding to conduct a 3-year longitudinal study where we worked with the same set of schools and worked alongside the same set of pupils, so following them from year 3 through to year 5 and determining what would happen if we ensured that their classrooms were full of representative and inclusive titles, as well as having the opportunity to meaningfully engage with those titles alongside the creatives of those titles to see what impact that would have in terms of their reader and writer identity. And starting with the question at the top there, do we have enough inclusive representative books in our book corners? What do we have? What's the nature of it? What's the quality of it? If we do, the next question is, do we have opportunities to meaningfully engage with them? Not just pull them out in October because it's Black History Month, or pull them out once a year around a topic, but do they meaningfully have the opportunity to engage with them? Are they learning directly from the creatives themselves to have the opportunity to learn more about authentic processes? Is the literature an integral part of the literacy programme of study? Are these core elements of their literature programme? Does the literature form the basis of wider programmes of study? You know, if that's happening in literacy, what's happening in history? What's happening in geography? What's happening in our foundation subjects? Are all of our resources inclusive, and do they support the study of these texts? And I'll talk more about this in the workshop that we have together. And does our provision meet the needs and interests of every learner by reflecting the realities and the realities of the wider world? These are universal questions that we should be asking, period, when thinking about how we support our children. So in asking those questions and creating the opportunity to address these questions within our context, when every school participating in the programme, these are the kinds of things that have come through. So in terms of impact on reader identity, the children are devouring books. We have multiple anecdotes of teachers talking about the fact that children that weren't previously reading now just cannot get enough. You know, as fast as they're stocking it, it's coming off the shelves. We have instances in terms of writer identity where children are no longer writing because they're directed to write. They're writing because they're compelled to write. So can I take some paper out into the playground, miss? Because I've got a thing, I've got to get it out before it goes. You know, having writing journals that are taking home and just splurging in that way. So it's a shift in the dynamic around direction versus compulsion, which has been touched on this morning as well. Emulating artistic devices, so learning directly from the author, illustrators and poets that we've worked with, understanding why they do what they do in the books that they produce, and using that as a means to inspire the production and publication of their own titles. Listening to Ken Wilson-Max talking about the ways in which he's used the end papers as an ongoing feature of the title to foreshadow where we'll find Lenny. And then taking that on board and creating opportunities for foreshadowing and consolidating narrative arcs within their own storytelling. Here, they've not only taken inspiration from Ken, but they've also taken inspiration from Lucy Farford, another author-illustrator that we worked with. So the grey at the beginning end paper is symbolising the headspace of the character at the beginning of the storyline, and the brightness of the end papers signifying the journey, the narrative journey that they've gone on. So some real sophistication in terms of what they're emulating there, and their understanding of narrative structure and character development in that respect. Emulating artistic processes, such as in the case of Maisie Chan. Maisie sharing some of the ways in which she researches for a book, then inspired a child to go on in their own fiction that they were writing to sign up to download. Oh my God, I'm showing my age. To download Duolingo and learn Japanese so that they could insert authentic phrases as part of the dialogue in their story. So that's the kind of level of kind of authenticity we're speaking about here. Validating cultural and linguistic expression in the learning space. So hearing firsthand from Valerie Bloom and working with Valerie Bloom's poetry and thinking about the role of language and dialect and elevating the status of that. That's not something that you park at the classroom door. That's something that's an integral component. That's an asset. That's something that you're bringing into the space that enriches and enlivens the work that you do. So it's not just about connection, but it's also about the possibility, creative possibilities that can create, and honouring that linguistic heritage in that way. The ways in which they've been able to validate presence through the development of artistic skills. So working firsthand with an author-illustrator like Lucy Farford, who talks about the ways in which she renders skin tone and complexion through watercolour, and giving them the skill to be able to do that themselves. And that in itself exposing the fact that we don't have the art materials and we don't have the skill to be able to support children to render skin tones and complexions in their diversity. So if we don't have that, then there is a silent unspokenness about the marginalisation of that presence in the classroom. And so then that as a knock-on is giving children more confidence and more a sense of autonomy around representing and presenting themselves and their ideas in the learning space, and in particular with regards to their writing. And then ultimately leading to literature that liberates learners and offers passports of possibility, because what we're finding is it's shifting mindsets. It's not just shifting them as readers and as writers, it's shifting them as learners and as individuals. So instances where the boys now are not playing Marvel heroes in the playground, they're playing being Carl Nova, the poet. They're playing being Joseph Coelho, the poet, which is phenomenally powerful in terms of aspiration, in terms of ambition, and in terms of enlightenment around this. Also having instances where this is Inferno Girl. So this was as part of the project, what we in each unit, they're working towards their own publications. So publishing picture books, publishing poetry anthologies, publishing their own fiction. So this is Inferno Girl, and this child not only completed quite a stunning book, actually, inspired by Inferno Girl, but decided to dress up as Inferno Girl for World Book Day. So that's the next level of where we're going to. There's been much debate in recent times around the limited scope for children to be able to have a breadth of characters to dress up into, but to go beyond that and to be dressing up as your own character is a beautiful next level kind of entity. So ultimately what it has done for us is really refined and consolidated our thinking about the end game, which I think chimes with everything that has been said this morning. The end game isn't about what they can achieve on a piece of paper in year 6. That's a technical end game. But the end game has to be, how do we ensure that everything we do, from the moment they walk into our doors to the moment they leave us in year 6, helps them to move towards having a healthy, autonomous sense of self as a learner. And what we feel is that through an investment of ensuring they have access to meaningfully engage with thought-provoking, quality-affirming literature, creative teaching approaches that encourage and instill learner autonomy, meaningful engagement with professional authors and creatives that will give you the windows of insight into how they do what they do and why, the demystifying of that process, if you like, and teaching approaches that enable them to emulate those creative approaches will lead to that end goal. And it will lead to them ticking all the boxes they need to tick on that kind of base level, but it will do so much more. And ultimately, that's why we all came into this profession. No one came into this profession because they want to fill out. I mean, if you did come into the profession because you love a spreadsheet, power to you. But I know that's not why we did it. I know that's not why we did it. We did it because that's what we want. We want Franks to be talking about us in the future in the way that Frank speaks about his children, his former teachers. That's why we do it. We do it because we want to make a difference. And we truly believe that through this work, you can make a difference. And through all the means that have been spoken about today, you can make a difference. This is a particularly difficult time for us as a profession and as a country and as a world. But books and you combined can make a phenomenal difference. So thank you very much for your time.